Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week you're in for a treat, as we have Louise Bodt joining us to talk about European goldfinches. Louise is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago and the Field Museum using introduced birds to study rapid evolutionary change. She's currently studying an introduced species in the U.S., European goldfinches. Not very many people realize it, but there's a population of European goldfinches living in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin that has been here since the early 2000s. The population has been living under the radar and has continued to survive in the wild. There have been examples of the species being introduced in other parts of the world, such as Bermuda, where Louise and John have both been to study them. Learn about how they got here, what their current status is, and make sure to Google them because they're truly beautiful and exotic-looking birds. Crazy to think that they're living in Illinois right now. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. All right, well, Louise, do you want to introduce yourself and kind of give the audience just kind of a little background on you and what you've been studying and who you are?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Louise. Wait, should I do my full name?
Sure, if you want to.
All right. Yeah. I'm Louise Bodt, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and I work with John and Shannon at the Field Museum. And I've been interested in science for about as long as I can remember, but I only started studying birds during my master's, where I worked on European starlings, and then came across an opportunity to study European goldfinches during my PhD, and so that's kind of how I landed here.
Cool.
Very cool.
And so do you want to kind of give an overview of the European goldfinch, like their status right now in the U.S.? Because I know that we went out with you last summer and actually saw some, and we hadn't even realized that they were here. So do you want to kind of talk a little bit about how they got here and where they are overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, there's a small population in Illinois, and I can tell you a little bit about my journey finding out about them, which kind of correlates with the actual event itself. So a lot of the information that we have on this population is from Julie Craves, who's another researcher, and so a lot of the digging into sort of their history in Illinois, in the Western Great Lakes region, is all work that she's done combing through a lot of records. So I have to give her a shout out because she's done a lot of work. And so I kind of didn't know exactly what I wanted to study, but I knew I was interested in studying introduced birds. And I knew I was moving to Chicago. And so I kind of randomly stumbled across Julie's webpage asking for people to send in sightings of European goldfinches around the Chicago area, Illinois, Wisconsin area. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. That's really close to where I'm about to move. And so, I read her whole paper that she published in 2008, which was sort of a status update on this bird that she had asked people to send in records of. And so in her digging, she found out that they were introduced by a bird importer who basically, was selling birds for the pet trade. Lots of different birds, not just European goldfinches. But around 2001, it seems to correlate with a avian influenza outbreak and some fears about importing birds. All of a sudden, there were a ton of records from all around McHenry County and Lake County, Illinois.
And was that legal to be trading birds like that, or is that frowned upon?
They're a pretty common bird in the pet trade, it turns out.
Okay.
And so actually that's an interesting thing where they show up at Montrose on a semi-occasional basis.
Oh, wow.
And they're almost all escapees from Chicago, from somebody's individual bird getting out.
I don't know. This thing seems a little dodgy.
Yeah,
to me.
Yeah, I don't know if he... It might have been legal because I know there are import records.
Oh, okay.
But how much is transparent? I don't know.
I mean,
totally.
Where are these birds actually from, right? So there's no way of checking that when he says they're from X, Y, or Z place, that's where they're actually.
Okay.
And he was
And now Louise will figure that out.
sure, and he was not just
Yeah.
he didn't just have European goldfinches. He had greenfinches, which he had a bunch of different European species,
Okay.
and all the others have had this little peak of period of time right after they were released, where they were around, and then they disappeared.
Oh,
Okay.
And the goldfinches have persisted, and it's become a really interesting story up in Lake County.
yeah.
Yeah.
Did he purposely release them, or was it a mistake? Or
It's unclear.
okay.
There's a couple of ideas of what happened. One is because of the avian influenza, he released them to avoid the imported birds like passing around the flu. Another idea is that he was just an irresponsible person, just release them. But I think those are kind of like the main thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there's really a concrete answer.
Sure.
Okay.
Apparently, he had a lot of birds in his aviaries that he
Okay.
had around his house.
Is there any idea like how many it started with, like when they were all released, or is that too hard to?
I
to know?
don't think. I don't think Julie came across. I know she has like numbers of records from like the bird import. I think in past years it was something like 9,000 European goldfinches per year or something, and then after some of these events have taken place, like it dipped down to like below 1,000 a year. And I don't know the dates and timing for all of those, but I know that there are import records for a lot of them, but I don't know if we really know like how many were released. But the area where they were spotted in the very early days after that was very wide ranging, whereas now they're very concentrated along like some of the places where we look for them in Lake County.
If it weren't for Louise, I would not know this bird existed around here. You know of them in the pet trade, but the idea that there's a breeding population of those in Illinois, and I could live here for 25 years and not have ever heard of them is bizarre.
Right.
Well, and it turns out sort of nationally and globally, it's got an interesting history of being introduced in various places, which is something that's been fun to learn about too.
Because they've been in the U.S. before, right?
Yeah, they have. They have been introduced to several places throughout the U.S., and even have been established for a time, but then have disappeared. So I know there's at least one instance where they were introduced in the 1800s into Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which is very close to where I'm from. So got to give a shout out to Greenwood Cemetery. And that population persisted until there was still sightings of them throughout New York City into the 1900s, and then later on in Long Island, and then they seemingly disappeared around the 1950s. Thinking it has to do with habitat changes, development of land, but yeah.
And they're called European goldfinches, but we should actually talk a little bit about the distribution of the species as it is across Europe and Asia.
Definitely. So, first of all, I didn't say this before, but I should have. In their native range, there's actually two different types, two different groups that look slightly different from one another. So one of them is found more on the on the western side in the Western European areas, and those have like black on their head. They have a little like black cap. And then on the eastern side, more towards like the Middle East and Asia, there's a group which has gray. And so there are these two larger groups within them, many more groups, but they are slightly different from each other. And that is something that personally I'm interested in looking at, because if they look that different, what's underlying some of those differences. And the ones that we have in Illinois have black on their head. So they're part of the Cardwellis group is what we call them.
Is that the Western European or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Western
the Western.
European,
Okay.
yes.
With an interesting caveat with respect to the fact that West goes from basically Russia all the way over to the UK.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
it's more widespread than the gray-headed one, but still, yeah, they might overlap. They do overlap on the map, but whether or not they're, interbreeding, I don't know.
Yeah, and it looks like these birds that are in Lake County are actually part of the the easternmost population of the western birds.
Oh, okay.
So they're bigger than we have a great collection at the Field Museum. How many we've got?
261.
Oh,
And
wow.
and they're covering a lot of these populations. That's one of the things that Louise has been working on is taking measurements and looking at the morphometrics of the different populations to try to see if there are differences in these described subspecies. Because how many are there? They're like
About 14.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do they all have like the red on their face, or is that just kind of unique to the ones that are here?
They all have the red on their
Okay.
face. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
really like pretty birds when you see them in the wild. It's
Yeah.
like striking.
Yes, they are very pretty.
Yeah.
and they're minimally dimorphic in the sense that red on the face is almost the same in males and females,
Okay.
which is interesting too.
Louise, had you seen them like when you read that paper by Julie? Like, because I feel like they're such like, and actually, could you describe what they look like a little bit? Because for people that maybe haven't seen them.
Yeah. So for the first part, crazy enough, I had only just seen them a few months before in Greenwood Cemetery.
Oh,
I saw a
crazy.
pair of them. So that was really exciting too. I was like, wow, I just saw this bird for the first time a few months ago, and now
Yeah.
I'm reading about it. Describing it. Let's see. Well, I don't really know why they're called goldfinches because they don't really look as yellow as our American goldfinches, but they do have some yellow on their wing. They're largely like brown on their body, although there's some differences in the way that their chest looks. So in some subspecies or populations, they're a little bit more like cinnamon brown or even white. And then in other places, it's a lot more gray. So that is very variable across their native distribution. They all have that red face that you mentioned. And then the ones that have a more, that have a black cap, they have some white around their head and face as well, whereas the gray ones are generally like almost entirely gray in that area. And then there's some like different patterns of white spots on their tail and on their wings, which also seems to be pretty variable depending on the geographic location where they're found. How variable? Sort of a question mark.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
definitely there's a main difference between the gray and the black cap because the gray ones have like fewer larger white spots on their wings, whereas the one here has several white spots.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's surprisingly little work done on this bird in terms of the population structure and things. And then why don't you say a little bit about where they've been introduced in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so they have been introduced to several other places. So in addition to this recent Illinois, we talked about some historical ones like the one in New York, which doesn't exist anymore. They also were introduced in Bermuda. And so, we had a chance to see them in Bermuda last year, which was really cool to see them in a very small island and sort of look at their behavior, what they were doing, what they were eating in that location. So in Bermuda, the story is that they were all cage bird releases that began this population that was there, and probably they were birds that originated from the UK, but nobody has tested that.
Okay.
And then they've also been introduced to a lot. You'll notice when talking about introductions, there's a lot of patterns in where things are introduced, and that's because of colonialism and where Europeans were going. So another two places that are very common, Australia and New Zealand.
Okay.
So they've also been introduced there. And then there are some small populations in Uruguay and Argentina, but I've only seen about one paper, maybe two, talking a little bit about those. So I don't really know many of the details regarding those introductions, but I know that they do have small pockets of them around there.
So I looked this up because I was fascinated I wanted to see who described them.
Yeah.
And they were first described, not to science, Linnaeus did that, but they were first described and illustrated in 1555, which is really some of the first illustrations like that. And my first introduction to them was they were part of Vermeer's painting. And so if you look at that, the girl with a pearl, is that a pearl earring?
Pearl earring,
is
yeah.
that what it's called? Yeah, there's a goldfinch in there.
Oh, wow.
And if you look at other Madonna and child kind of things, they're often depicted with goldfinches because they're thought of as good luck and a good omen, things like that. So, yeah. So they're very common in art, historical times.
And then so if there's these populations kind of them all over the world, where does like the population that's in northern Illinois, Wisconsin rank as far as, I mean, I know we're still trying to figure out how many there are and everything, but is it kind of on pace to grow the same as some of these other ones, or is there any way to tell at this point? I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah. We can't predict the future. So I have no idea. But I will say that what we've seen in looking at and finding them around these days is that they seem to have plenty of resources in teasel, right? There's a lot of teasel around and thistle and all of these things.
And these are introduced European plants. So they're plants from probably the native distribution of this population even.
Okay.
Wow.
And so it sure seems like in the non-breeding season, at least, that's great for them. They're probably feeding their chicks insects and things for the most part. So they're clearly finding those too. But that's one of the things that nobody knows about. And so it's really been kind of fun.
They do say that they feed insects to their young.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then Louise, like the ones that you saw in Bermuda, like would they just stay in Bermuda or would they go elsewhere, like for different parts of the year?
They're resident in Bermuda.
Okay.
Yeah.
And same with like the Lake County ones. Have they been here?
We have found them year-round in this area, but we don't really know much about their movement, whether there's several pockets of smaller groups that meet up and form one larger group, or there's a few larger groups. It's unclear to me right now whether or not they move around very much. They obviously move around like on a daily basis. We see them at different locations, probably fairly close by. They could be from the same like general large group.
Okay.
So they're obviously moving around this small area, but how far that goes, I don't know. Like there's sightings of them in Wisconsin. Is that a different little pocket, or are they moving back and forth between Lake County and Wisconsin? I don't know.
But that's really an interesting distinction relative to a lot of other introduced birds. So, for instance, we have another graduate student who's working in the museum down at and he's a U of C student who's working on parrots. And parrots have been introduced in cities all over the world, but it's pretty unusual for the parrots to get out of the cities. And the interesting thing about these European goldfinches to me is that they were released way out in the suburbs, even probably in the countryside at some level. And that countryside is clearly similar enough to their native range that they're certainly making a go of it for the last, 25 years or so.
Yeah, apparently the data show that if you cultivate land, you increase the populations of these goldfinches. So they clearly like whatever that does to the teasel or thistles, they like that being done. So introduce plants, introduce birds, a match made in heaven.
Mm-hmm. But another interesting point there that is really kind of fun to think about is when we went to Bermuda, there's no teasel and there's no thistle. Mm-hmm. And so they're eating another very small seeded seed head species called, what was it, sow thistle, I think is what the our local expert Miguel Mejias called them. But then they spend a lot of their time in these casuarina trees, which are all over Bermuda, and these are Australian. And so one of the questions that I think will be really fun to look at the genomic level for Louise is, what does that mean for a European goldfinch genome to be suddenly foraging in a completely different type of plant, because that's what you have available to you.
You're going to predict the future because that's part of what you're studying. I mean, why study introduced taxa? That's a common question, and I guess I've had that question too in my mind, but that's just a lack of thinking or foresight, because every time something gets introduced, it's a chance to study what happens when things get introduced into novel environments, which in theory could help us understand how landscape use and climate change will affect the birds here. So there are these natural experiments that tell us something about how resilient birds are and what genetics are associated with that resilience, how much variability is there within and between populations, and genetic and otherwise, and what does that say about survivability? So, you can learn a lot by studying something that you think is trash. Besides, the pandemic taught me that I like house sparrows, which if you'd asked me that 5 years ago, I would not have said that were the case, but it is. I love my house sparrows in my yard.
Yeah, well, I would say European goldfinches have a lot on house sparrows in terms of what they look like.
They're very cool.
Yeah, but they're
looking.
not in our backyard.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Louise, you're failing. Get them in our
We just
yard.
need them to get a little further south. Then in Chicago, we'll all be able to see them.
Yeah.
So as you've been studying, have you noticed their range expanding, or?
Well, I think it's hard to say because a lot of the records from eBird that I used to get an idea of places to look, sometimes people don't report them. So if you're listening and you use eBird, you should report when you see European goldfinches in Illinois, because I actually use a lot of that data to track where they are and to see whether that range is changing over time. And as I mentioned earlier, Julie has a lot of personal correspondence from people to look at records through time. And one thing I'll say is, so I said a little bit about after they were initially released, right? You have records from a very large area, and they're scattered, and there's sort of this like initial large extent that they cover. And then you sort of see them die down, those records. And then it's not till 2015 when you start to see consistent records of them in a smaller area. So it's almost 15 years after that initial. So it could be that that's part of what is called a lag phase, which is sort of the dip before something gets established. And so you'll hear that term a lot when you're talking about introduced species. So there's this initial burst, very few records for a few years, and then you'll start to see very consistent records. And so I don't know if the area is expanding. I do know that since we've been looking at them, we started seeing them very consistently in a few places. But as I track not just eBird, but also, like Facebook photos in birding groups around the area, I am starting to see photos of them at bird feeders, and we've even had like people tell us that they have them at their feeders. And they're a little bit further from that spot where we were seeing them consistently in the beginning. But I don't know if they've been there all along.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, one neat thing about these finches is just like American goldfinch would do. In the non-breeding season, they form these monospecific flocks and fly around looking for food. And then when the breeding season comes, they break up into pairs, and they get a lot scarcer in terms of the records on eBird because they're just people aren't looking for them as much as we'd like them to be.
And they have really cool beaks if you get to look at them close up. You can tell from looking at pictures, like they're tweezers. They're very pointy because they have to stick their head in these plants that, imagine, it's pretty scratchy. Might not be so pleasant.
Those teasel heads are incredibly scratchy.
So
And
you better be good at extracting the things you need to eat.
And we were looking at this, like a single head has like 600 seeds or something in it. And so they persist for a long period of time. So teasel dies, and then for several years, there's just the dead heads sticking up, but they'll still have teasel seeds in them. Wow. And so one of the things that seems likely is that, as a matter of fact, you can see this if you go on eBird. If you look at pictures across the European distribution of European goldfinches, they're routinely sitting on these spiky seed heads of different types of things, including teasel. And so they seem to be really well adapted to go around and do that. And as a matter of fact, one of the things I'm fascinated by is that face coloration and the black on the top of the head could even be a mechanism to actually kind of make predators think they're being looked at while the bird is sitting there foraging with its bill deep inside a teasel head. Just because it's a very unusual coloration pattern for the family, so they're a fascinating little bird.
That's awesome. I remember like very vividly, like when RJ and I went with you, Louise and John, to see them at Middle Fork Savannah, and like how incredibly excited we were when we finally spotted one, and we went back I think the next day and saw a whole bunch again, and we're so excited. And I think they're, when you do see one, it's so shocking because they don't look natural. Like they don't look like they belong around here. And I said to RJ, they remind me of like Ronald McDonald. Like it's like a little clown face. And the coloring and stuff. And I wanted to ask you, Louise, do you have tips for people that are interested in trying to find them, like in the Chicago area?
Yeah. Well, the places that we've had the most consistent success in the summer is Middle Fork Savannah. And one thing that's kind of fun about going to Middle Fork Savannah in the summer is last summer we saw like a lot of juveniles. Probably the majority were juveniles, which is, proof that they're reproducing in this area. And that was pretty fun to see all the juveniles in this group together at Middle Fork Savannah. And then we've gone to a bunch of different parks and forest preserves and around Lake County, and we have seen them in a lot of different places. The most we've seen at one time has been at Old School Forest Preserve in the winter. But yeah, they're kind of all over the place. They do visit feeders, so if you've got a feeder in your backyard, and you might see them.
Awesome. If you go out, you should put your sightings on eBird, and most people have pretty good cameras even in their pockets these days, and you should take pictures, because one of the things we don't know very much about is what kind of phenotypic variation there is in these introduced populations. We don't know really where all these birds came from, and if you saw a gray-headed bird, Louise would be very excited. So attach your pictures to the records that you get, because it matters for people who want to study these things. And don't let anybody tell you that they don't count because they're introduced, because bird people are snobby about things like that, because they do matter, and it is interesting, and there is a lot to learn even from an introduced bird besides they're really pretty. You could do worse than going out and finding goldfinches.
That's right.
Are they really smart too? Is there a story that
Yeah.
I think we started talking about on another episode about them doing tricks or something like that.
Yeah, Louise and I'm fascinated by the idea that they used to be sold in New York. They were sold for $1,000 a piece, which is completely wild when you think about, over 100 years ago, they were being sold for $1,000
Oh my gosh.
because they're really good companions. So it's not just humans today that find them fun to have in a cage in their house. But so they've been taught to do all kinds of wacky things, like play cards. I'm not joking.
Wait, like literally like
Yes.
play cards with someone?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
hilarious.
And then Louise got in touch with Julie today because we can't find some of the things that we know we've shared about other things they do. So, Louise, this one is hilarious, too. They have to earn their keep.
Okay, you know those crow videos where the crows have to like solve a puzzle to get their food? It was kind of a similar idea, but the goldfinch, it was a photo of this whole setup, and the goldfinch had to like pull like a specific thing to get its food, and yeah, it looked like a kind of I don't know simple machine type operation from.
But as I was trying to find a whole bunch of things that I know I had found before, but I couldn't find again, apparently the fact that they play cards means that they're really often on cards, on playing cards. So you can buy, if you do a search, that's what you'll find is a ton, even historical playing cards with goldfinches on them.
cool.
So I guess they were known. If you're going to pay $1,000 for something back then, you better get a lot out of it. That's a huge amount of money. Even
play
now,
cards.
there's no way I'm paying that kind of money for.
Today, as Amanda and I were prepping, I was telling her, I was like, I think they play cards. And Amanda was like, I don't remember. So I did a Google search, and it was like European Goldfinch cards. And all I saw were cards that had goldfinches on it. I couldn't find an article.
And then I
So
can't
was like,
find
"Did I hear
this,
that
but
right?"
I know it exists. I didn't dream it because I shared it. Louise knows. But there's recipes, Victorian recipes for food to keep your goldfinch happy.
Oh.
And I cannot for the life of me find them. So if anybody out there can find those again for me, they should send it to us.
I would just go around and find a bunch of teasel heads and shake out a bunch of seeds, and
Well, that's
I think
boring.
you're good to go.
That is not what people did. I wanted to make it when Louise defended her proposal. I thought it would be fun to.
As a human snack.
It doesn't, but it does not seem like things you should actually eat, from what I remember about it. But people, think about that. They cared enough to try to bake treats for goldfinches.
That is awesome. Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting close on time. Is there anything else European Goldfinch related we want to chat about?
I don't think so. Just
No?
really want to encourage people up in Lake County, southern Wisconsin, if you see them, put them in eBird.
Okay.
Yeah.
We do have one mailbag question. This was just a follow-up from Elizabeth, who emailed us last week. And she just said, one more point I should make so my Trinidadian in-laws don't get mad at me. Trinidad and Tobago actually has two national birds. The bird representing the island of Trinidad is the scarlet ibis, which we talked about last week. The bird representing Tobago is the coquerico. They pronounce it coquerico. She said, thanks again for your show, from Elizabeth.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I just want to thank Elizabeth, and I'll take this one because I went ahead and Googled it. So Trinidad and Tobago are one country, and their coat of arms has a scarlet ibis, which is what we were talking about before. And the other bird is a rufous-vented chachalaca, which is a member of it's a game bird from a South American family called the Crassidae. And what's really fascinating about this for me is that Trinidad and Tobago have an interesting biogeographic history in the sense that Trinidad is the larger of the two islands, and it's very close to the mainland and was connected at some point, whereas Tobago is never believed to have been connected. And so the interesting thing is the scarlet ibis are found on Trinidad, not very commonly on Tobago. And the chachalaca, which is the word is that I can't remember what.
Coquerico is what she said?
That's basically an onomatopoetic description of the call that the birds make.
Oh, wow.
But the interesting thing is these aren't particularly good they're not flighted birds, and yet there's a population of them on Tobago, and they're absent from Trinidad. And so this is a neat little biogeographic mystery, but it's got to be one of the best coat of arms I've seen
to look
have
it up.
both those
Yeah.
birds on there, because that's absolutely awesome.
That's so cool.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap it up then on this one. Cool. All right. Good. Thanks everyone for joining us. We love our listeners, every single one of you, and want to thank all of you for your support. If you have a question for us that you'd like read and answered on the podcast, send it to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe or follow in your podcast app so you always get our newest episodes sent your way. And if you'd be so kind as to leave us a review, we would love that as well. All right, see you all next week. Thank you.